So let's talk about body terminology. So first of all, everything in the body is described as if your patient is standing in anatomical position. So it doesn't matter if your patient has his feet over his head or what's going on. It's always as if you're standing straight with your feet roughly shoulder width apart, your arms down at the side with your palms facing forward. We'll talk more when we get to the skeletal system about why that is. So when we're talking about body terminology, it's a lot of memorization. So you're just going to spend some time memorizing a bunch of terms, and I recommend print off some pictures or find some pictures of somebody that you don't mind looking at. Maybe it's your kids, your significant other, pictures of yourself, doesn't matter to me, and just make a bunch of lines and arrows going to all of the different surface anatomy, tape it to your bathroom mirror, and practice every time you're in the bathroom brushing your teeth, naming the different parts of the body. So the first thing we're going to do before we get into that is look at directional terms. So if something is towards my head, we say that it is superior. If it is towards my feet, it is inferior. If it's towards my back, it is posterior. Or you might say that it is dorsal. If it's towards the front, then it is anterior or ventral. If it's towards the sides, so this direction, away from the midline of the body, then we say that it is lateral. If it is towards the midline of my body, then we say that it is medial. And if we're talking about our limbs, our appendages, so leg and arm, if they are closer to the points of attachment, then we say that it is proximal. And if it's closer or further away from the point of attachment, so near your hands or feet, then we say that it is distal. Now keep in mind, directional terms are always relative terms. So for example, if I think about my arm, my elbow is distal relative to my shoulder, but it is proximal relative to my wrist. So directional terms are always relative to something else. When we're doing dissections or we're taking images of the body, we're going to do these in different planes. If I am separating the front of my body from the back of my body, so we're using this kind of purplish colored plane here to kind of slice me right down the middle and pull the front away from the back, then we are using a frontal plane. If I am cutting myself down the middle and separating into right and left halves, which we can see with this kind of bluish plane right here, actually the pink one does as well, then we say that it is a sagittal plane. If it's dead center, right down the middle, which is what we're seeing here with this blue one, then it is mid-sagittal. And if we're cutting the body top to bottom, so we're separating superior from inferior, which is what we're doing here with this orange plane, then that is a transverse plane. So as you can see here, if I'm doing different CT scans or MRIs or X-rays, I'm getting different cuts or different planes of dissection. It's important to be able to know what kind of section is going to give you what kind of image, because if you're doing some kind of imaging, you need to know what you're looking for and what's going to be the best view to find that. So anatomical position, as we said, is standing straight up and down, feet about shoulder width apart, arms at your side, and your palms facing forward. The head of the body, we said, is superior. Towards the foot of the body is inferior. Towards the front is anterior or ventral. towards the back is posterior or dorsal. And if I'm lying face up, which is how you typically think of a patient laying on the bed face up, then we say that they are supine. If they're lying face down, then they are prone. Now, if I have an injury, let's say a cut, and it's near the surface of the body, then we say that that is superficial. If it's closer to the core of the body or to the organs of the body, then we say that it is deep. So you might talk about a deep incision or a superficial incision or a deep wound or a superficial wound. If it's away from the midline, again we say that is lateral. So that means out towards my sides. If it's towards the midline, towards the middle of my body, then it is medial. If it's close to the origin, so close to my shoulder or close to my hip, then we say that it is proximal. And if it's far from that point of origin, so I'm closer to my hand or closer to my foot, then we say that it is distal. So this just gives you an example. You can pause the video and see if you can name all these directional terms and then come back in and we'll rename them. So if it's towards A, we're talking about A and B are this appendage, the arm. So towards A would be distal. Towards B would be proximal. So that's towards the shoulder, right here. Distal is towards the hand. If I'm towards the midline, which is C, then we say that is medial. And if it's towards the sides, towards D, then it is lateral. Towards the head would be superior. And towards the feet would be inferior. Again, always relative terms. So we could say that the nose is superior to the mouth. The ears are lateral relative to the nose. Your heart is roughly like this, and then your lungs are sitting around either side. So you'd say that your heart is medial relative to the lungs. Just to review the body sections, so I've got 3 brains here. Pause the video and try to name each of these planes, and then come back and I will tell you which ones they are. So if I'm looking at this brain here, this is the front or anterior, and this is the back or posterior of this brain. I can tell that because I'm seeing this kind of cauliflower-looking cerebellum here at the back. I always just think the brain is shaped a little bit like a baseball cap. It's wider in the back and it gets narrower towards the front, towards the brim. So this image right here is taken using this plane right down the middle. So that would be a mid-sagittal plane. This one is cutting the top away from the bottom. So this would be a transverse. And then this one is cutting the anterior away from the posterior, front from back. So this image up here is done using a frontal section. Depending on how we do our sections, we can sometimes get different images and views, and we need to understand that what something looks like when I take an image of it is going to depend on how exactly I'm taking that view. For example, if I look at a bone, a long bone, maybe like the humerus in my arm, and I do just a straight cross section, then when I look at it where the cut is here, it's going to be a perfect circle with a nice hollow center. But if I take an oblique section, that means at an angle, now it's going to look like an oval. And if I do a longitudinal section, it's going to cut it right down the long way, and it's going to make it look like a piece of celery. So if I think of things that are tubes, like blood vessels, ureters, the trachea, the intestines, and so on, how I cut through that with my image is going to give me these different types of shapes, and I need to be aware of that. All right, let's take a look at the body cavities. So over here, put this down here, over here, the back, we have the dorsal cavity. So these two cavities are connected. They are going to house the brain up here and then the spinal cord in this part of the cavity. The dorsal cavity can be broken into cranial and then vertebral. So that's my dorsal cavity. It's completely connected in the back, so cerebrospinal fluid can flow between both cranial and vertebral cavities, but it is not connected at all to my ventral cavities. So all of these cavities in the front are my ventral cavities, and we're going to break those down further. So I have a diaphragm, a muscle that sits right here between these upper cavities and these lower cavities. So that's where my diaphragm is. Important for breathing. And my cavities above are going to include, the entire thing here will be the thoracic cavity. That can be subdivided into the cavities that house the lungs, which would be pleural, and the cavity that houses the heart, which is the pericardial cavity. Now, the pericardial cavity is part of this larger cavity here that includes the thymus and the blood vessels that come in and out of the top of the heart. That entire area that includes those other structures is called the mediastinum. The cavity below the diaphragm, this whole thing here, is the abdominopelvic cavity. And it can be divided into abdominal and pelvic. Now, these two cavities down here are completely connected. So if you have something that's leaking in my abdominal cavity, it can get into my pelvic cavity. However, it cannot get up into the thoracic cavity. And my pericardial and pleural cavities are also separate from each other because of membranes. Now, my abdominal cavity has another name too, which is the peritoneal cavity. If it ends in al, it's an adjective, so we say it's the peritoneal cavity, or we can say it is the peritoneum, and that makes it a noun. So there are peritoneal membranes that line those cavities down there. You should know what organs, major organs, are found in each of these different cavities. So this is just showing you a completely labeled view, which you can find in your textbook online. There are other small cavities of the head, which we will talk a little bit more about later. You have middle ear cavities. You have orbital cavities, which houses the eye, nasal cavities, paranasal sinuses that are as part of that. And we'll, like I said, talk about those more when we get to different systems later on in the semester and next semester. Now, your abdominal pelvic cavity is a large cavity that houses a lot of organs, so we like to subdivide that into quadrants and regions. So you've got 4 quadrants. There's the right upper quadrant. Remember, we're looking at your patient facing you, so this is their right side over here and their left side over here. The left upper quadrant, the left lower quadrant, and the right lower quadrant. So my liver sits mostly in my right upper, but kind of goes over into my left upper a little bit. My stomach is mostly in the left upper here, and then it comes over into my small intestine. My small intestine pretty much goes through all 4 quadrants. My large intestine starts down in the right lower quadrant, where my little appendix is sitting attached to it, and it's going to go up, across, down, and out, so it is also going through all 4 quadrants. My spleen is tucked behind the stomach in my left upper, and my urinary bladder sits right below the intestines, and it's in the lower part of the right lower and left lower quadrants. If you have a uterus, then the uterus would sit kind of... You can also break the abdominal pelvic area into 9 regions. So you have the umbilical region is in the middle, kind of where your umbilical cord or your belly button is. You have the right lateral and left lateral regions. Again, this is my right, this is my left. But we also can call that the right flank and left flank. You've got your epigastric region, which is above the umbilical, and your pubic region, which is below the umbilical. And then you have your inguinal regions. So you've got right inguinal and left inguinal, and then hypochondriac, which you got upper right hypochondriac and left hypochondriac. The six regions that are really critical and key for nursing would be your umbilical, your epigastric, your pubic, and then your 2 flanks. Now, it's important to realize that even though 90% of your anatomy matches the textbook, there are a lot of differences from person to person. So you can have differences in nerves, blood vessels, small muscles, even some bones. And the most extreme example that I've seen that I think is really interesting is a genetic disorder where all of the internal organs are mirror imaged. So if we go back here, that means that this person's liver, if I kind of change colors here for a second, so they would have their liver would be over here, their stomach would be on the right side, their appendix would be on the left side, their spleen would be on the right side. So everything would be reversed. And in fact, in some cases, even up here, the heart would tip to the right side instead of tipping to the left. So it's important to realize that. You can have a lot of variation from person to person. All right, we'll stop there and we'll come back and go over all of the surface anatomy.